10 ways you sabotage yourself. Right when life starts to work. The thread you pull when everything is fine. You finally get what you've been working toward. The relationship is good, the job is stable, the anxiety has quieted. And then, quietly, almost invisibly, you start pulling the thread. Not dramatically, not consciously. You don't sit down one morning and decide to ruin what you've built. It happens in smaller movements. A conversation you turn into an argument for no clear reason. A distance you create, right when someone was getting close. A decision to leave, a job, a relationship, a version of yourself, right before it became something permanent. And the strangest part is that it never feels like sabotage in the moment. It feels like clarity. It feels like you're finally seeing something the other person can't. It feels like caution, like self-awareness, like protecting yourself from something that hasn't happened yet. That's what makes this pattern so difficult to interrupt. It doesn't announce itself as destruction. It arrives dressed as logic. Most people, when they think about self-sabotage, imagine someone who is visibly failing. Someone who can't hold a job, can't maintain a relationship, can't get out of their own way long enough to make anything work. But that's not the version we're talking about today. The version we're talking about is subtler and in many ways more dangerous. Because it targets exactly the moments when things are working, not the crisis, the calm, not the failure, the beginning of something real. There's a question worth sitting with before we go any further, and it's not comfortable. Have you ever had something good, genuinely good, and felt somewhere underneath the surface that you were waiting for a reason to end it? Not because it was wrong, but because it felt too stable, too real, too close to something you might actually lose. That feeling has a structure. It follows patterns, and those patterns, once you can see them clearly, lose most of their power over you. The Stoics understood something about this, that modern psychology is only beginning to name precisely. Marcus Aurelius didn't write about self-sabotage as a moral failure. He wrote about it as a failure of perception, a misreading of what is actually happening inside us, mistaken for a reading of what is happening outside. Epictetus, who had every reason to destroy himself emotionally, built an entire philosophy around one radical act, seeing your own internal movements with complete honesty, without justification, without narrative. That's what this video is, not a list of things you're doing wrong, a mirror held up at exactly the moment you're about to pull the thread again. We're going to walk through 10 ways people sabotage themselves right when life starts to work, not to create shame, but to create the one thing that can actually interrupt the pattern, recognition. Because you cannot stop what you cannot see, and most of these patterns have been invisible for a very long time. Let's begin. You mistake calm for danger. There's something nobody tells you about survival. When you spend enough time in difficult environments, emotionally unstable homes, relationships built on tension, periods of your life where the threat was always just around the corner, your nervous system doesn't just respond to danger. It learns to expect it, and eventually it learns to need it, not because you enjoy suffering, but because suffering became the texture of normal, the baseline against which everything else was measured. So when the calm arrives, when the relationship is actually steady, when the job is actually working, when the version of your life you spent years trying to build finally becomes real, something inside you doesn't celebrate. So it braces. The absence of a problem begins to feel like a problem that hasn't revealed itself yet. This is one of the quietest and most destructive forms of self-sabotage, precisely because it never feels like sabotage. It feels like intelligence. Like you're the only one in the room who understands that good things don't last, that people eventually leave. That stability is just instability that hasn't shown its face yet. You call it realism. You call it emotional maturity. You tell yourself you're simply prepared for what's coming. But what you're actually doing is treating peace as a threat. Epictetus wrote in the Discourses that most human suffering comes not from circumstances themselves, but from the judgments we place on them. The event is neutral. What we make of it, what we decide it means, is where the damage begins. And when a person has spent long enough making suffering mean safety and calm mean danger, that judgment becomes automatic. It runs beneath conscious awareness, shaping decisions before the thinking mind has any chance to intervene. You don't decide to create tension in a stable relationship. You feel the stability, misread it as a warning, and your behavior adjusts accordingly. Without your permission, without your awareness, and often without any explanation you can give afterward. The person who mistakes calm for danger doesn't sabotage because they want chaos. They sabotage because chaos is the only emotional language they fully trust. Everything else feels like a translation they might be getting wrong. And here's what makes this particularly difficult to interrupt. The moment you create the tension, and the tension arrives, there's a brief and terrible sense of relief. Not because you wanted the conflict, but because the conflict confirmed what you already believed. The world is unstable. People are unpredictable. Nothing good holds. And now you have proof, the proof you manufactured yourself without realizing you were the one who built it. Marcus Aurelius returned to one idea across dozens of entries in the Meditations: the discipline of examining what you believe to be true about a situation before you act on it. Not as an intellectual exercise, as a survival practice. Because the mind that has learned to fear safety will find safety threatening everywhere. In every relationship, in every period of stillness, in every moment that doesn't demand an immediate response. The first step out of this pattern is not to force yourself to feel safe. It's to notice with complete honesty the moment you begin interpreting peace as a warning. That noticing, that brief pause between the feeling and the reaction, is where everything begins to change. But recognizing that you fear the calm is only part of the picture. Because some people don't fear stillness, they fear something else entirely. They fear what happens when someone gets close enough to actually see them. You test what you're afraid to lose. When something matters, genuinely matters in the way that only a few things in a person's life ever do, the natural response isn't always to hold it carefully. Sometimes it's to push it, to apply pressure, to see how much it can take before it breaks. This is the mechanics of the test, and almost everyone who has ever loved something deeply has run it at least once, usually without realizing that's what they were doing. It doesn't look like a test from the inside. It looks like a fight that starts for a small reason and escalates past anything the original reason could justify. It looks like withdrawal, becoming quieter, colder, less available, right at the moment when connection was deepening. It looks like impossible standards applied suddenly and without warning, as if the relationship or the opportunity had just failed a requirement that was never communicated. What's actually happening underneath all of it is a question the person can't bring themselves to ask directly. Is this real? Will you stay? Am I actually safe here? So instead of asking, they test. The problem, and this is the part that becomes genuinely destructive, is that the test is designed to fail. Not consciously, but structurally. Because what the person is testing for is unconditional permanence. They want proof that this thing, this person, this opportunity will survive anything, including being treated badly, including being pushed away, including being told, through behavior rather than words, that this person doesn't fully believe they deserve what they have. No relationship survives that test indefinitely. No opportunity remains open forever under sustained pressure. And so the test eventually produces exactly the outcome it was trying to prevent, and the person walks away with what feels like confirmation. I knew it wouldn't last. I knew they would leave. I knew I was right not to trust it. Marcus Aurelius wrote about the way the mind creates its own obstacles and then suffers from them as though they were external. The test is one of the clearest examples of this pattern. The obstacle isn't the relationship or the opportunity. The obstacle is the belief The deep, pre-rational conviction that good things must be proven repeatedly under conditions of stress before they can be trusted. And that belief, left unexamined, will outlast every relationship, every success, every moment of genuine connection. Epictetus made a distinction that matters here, between what belongs to us and what doesn't. Our judgments, our responses, our internal movements, these belong to us. The behavior of other people, the permanence of external things, the future, these don't. The test is an attempt to control what cannot be controlled, to force certainty out of a reality that is, by nature, uncertain. And it always extracts a price from exactly the thing you were trying to protect. There's a different kind of courage required here. Not the courage to fight or to endure. The courage to be in something good without demanding that it prove itself first. To allow the relationship to exist without placing it under constant interrogation. To trust, not blindly, not naively, but deliberately, as an act of will rather than a response to evidence. That kind of trust doesn't come naturally to someone who has learned to test everything they value. But it's the only thing that actually allows something worth keeping to remain. And yet, even when a person stops testing, there's often a quieter belief operating underneath, one that doesn't create conflict or demand proof. It simply whispers in the background of every good thing, "You don't actually deserve this." You confuse deserving with earning. There is a belief so embedded in some people that it functions less like a thought and more like a gravitational field. It shapes every decision, colors every success, and quietly ensures that nothing good ever fully lands. The belief is this: I am only allowed to have what I have suffered for, not earned through effort, suffered for. There's a difference. Effort is active. Effort is chosen. Effort is something you do with intention, moving toward something you want. Suffering is different. Suffering is what happens to you. And when a person builds their entire internal economy around the idea that pain is the only legitimate currency, that the only things worth having are the things that cost something in anguish, they create a psychological system in which happiness itself becomes suspect. Because happiness, by definition, doesn't hurt. And if it doesn't hurt, something must be wrong. This is one of the most invisible forms of self-sabotage, precisely because it masquerades as humility. The person who carries this belief doesn't look arrogant. They look modest. They deflect compliments. They minimize their own achievements. They find reasons why the good thing in front of them doesn't quite count, isn't quite real, isn't quite deserved. Yet. But underneath the humility is something much harder. A refusal to accept that value can exist independently of suffering. Their conviction that they must keep paying, keep earning, keep justifying their right to be here. In the relationship, in the career, in the version of life they've built. Epictetus understood this with particular clarity, having lived most of his life as a slave. His entire philosophy rested on a single foundational insight. Your worth is not determined by your circumstances, by what has been done to you, or by what you have had to endure. It is determined by the quality of your judgments and the integrity of your will. Not what life took from you, what you chose to do with what remained. The person who confuses deserving with earning will always find a way to disqualify their own success. The promotion comes, and immediately they wonder if it was politics, not merit. The relationship deepens, and they become convinced they're deceiving the other person somehow, that if the truth were fully known, they would leave. The life improves, and the improvement feels temporary, provisional, one mistake away from being revoked. Marcus Aurelius wrote about the way humans attach conditions to their own peace. We tell ourselves, I will allow myself to rest when I have done enough. I will allow myself to be loved when I am worthy enough. I will allow myself to succeed when I have proven enough. And the threshold always moves, because the point was never the threshold. The point was the movement itself, the permanent state of not quite there, which feels like discipline but functions as self-punishment. The practical question this raises is not philosophical, it's behavioral. When something good arrives in your life, genuinely good, unambiguously good, what is the first internal movement? Is it gratitude? Or is it the quiet search for the reason it doesn't count? Because that search, that reflexive auditing of your own right to have what you have, is where the thread gets pulled. Not in a dramatic moment of self-destruction, in the small daily accumulation of reasons why this isn't real, isn't permanent, isn't yours to keep. Stopping it doesn't require believing overnight that you deserve everything. It requires something smaller and more precise, noticing the audit as it begins, catching the moment the mind starts building the case against your own life, and choosing deliberately not to prosecute it. That choice, small, repeated, unglamorous, is what the Stoics called the work, not the philosophy, the practice. But there's another pattern that doesn't question whether you deserve what you have. It simply assumes quietly and with absolute certainty that it's about to be taken away. You become the problem before the problem arrives. There is a particular kind of intelligence that turns against itself. It's the intelligence of anticipation, the ability to see several moves ahead, to model outcomes before they happen, to prepare for what's coming before it arrives. In most contexts, this is a genuine strength. In the context of self-sabotage, it becomes one of the most sophisticated ways a person can destroy something good while convincing themselves they're being responsible. It works like this. Something in your life is going well, and your mind, trained by years of previous loss or disappointment, begins to run the simulation. What if this ends? What if the person leaves? What if the success is temporary? What if I'm wrong about this and the collapse is closer than I think? The simulation starts as a precaution, but it doesn't stay there. It metastasizes into behavior. You begin acting as though the collapse has already happened. You withdraw before the distance arrives. You become cold before the rejection comes. You stop investing in the relationship, the project, the version of yourself that was beginning to work. Because somewhere in the calculation, you decided that pulling back now would hurt less than being blindsided later. You tell yourself you're being realistic. You tell yourself you're protecting yourself. What you're actually doing is manufacturing the ending you were trying to avoid on a timeline of your own choosing, so that at least it happens on your terms. This is anticipatory self-sabotage, and it's particularly destructive because it carries the feeling of wisdom. It doesn't feel impulsive. It feels considered. It feels like you've thought it through, seen what others couldn't see, and made the mature decision to exit before the damage became worse. But the damage you're preventing is hypothetical. The damage you're causing is real. Seneca wrote about this with a precision that still lands centuries later. In his letters, he described the way humans voluntarily enter into suffering they imagine is coming, living through the loss before the loss happens, experiencing the rejection before the rejection occurs, paying the emotional price of an ending that may never arrive. He called it one of the most exhausting and least rational things a person can do, to suffer twice, once in imagination and once in reality. And sometimes, as when the anticipation becomes behavior, to suffer only in imagination, because the reality never came. The person destroyed the thing themselves, and the thing would have been fine. Marcus Aurelius returned constantly to the discipline of the present moment, not as a spiritual practice, as a practical one. The present moment is the only place where reality actually exists. The future is a projection, useful in certain doses, destructive in excess. When your behavior begins to be governed, not by what is happening, but by what you have decided will happen, you have left reality and entered a story you're writing yourself. And in that story, the ending is always the one you fear most, because fear is the author. The interruption of this pattern requires something that feels almost impossible to someone who has learned to anticipate loss, staying present in something good without immediately beginning to manage its imagined ending. Allowing the relationship to be what it is today, without modeling what it might become in 6 months when it falls apart. Allowing the success to exist without immediately calculating how long it can last. This is not naivety. The Stoics were not naive. They simply understood that the energy spent suffering in advance is energy stolen from the life that is actually in front of you, and that a person who is always managing the imagined collapse of their own life never fully lives the version of it that was working. There is a version of you that knows how to stay, that knows how to be present in something good without immediately preparing for its absence. Getting to that version doesn't require optimism. It requires the simple, disciplined act of returning your attention to what is real, not what you're afraid might become real, and choosing to act from there. But anticipation is only one form this takes. There's another pattern that doesn't fear the ending. It simply doesn't know what to do with the middle. You treat consistency like a trap. Ask someone who has spent years in survival mode what they're good at, and most of them will tell you the same thing without realizing it. They're good in a crisis. They know how to respond when everything is falling apart. They can hold themselves together under pressure, make decisions in chaos, function in environments that would paralyze someone else. What they struggle with, what genuinely destabilizes them in a way that crisis never does, is the ordinary, the Tuesday, the unremarkable week. The relationship that is simply good, without drama, without intensity, without the particular aliveness that comes from things being on the edge of breaking. Consistency, for a person shaped by instability, doesn't feel like safety. It feels like stagnation. It feels like something has gone quiet in a way that should concern you. The nervous system that learned to read intensity as engagement and chaos as proof of caring has no framework for what a healthy, stable, undramatic life actually feels like. So it interprets that stability as emptiness, as evidence that something is missing, as a kind of emotional flatness that must mean the relationship has died, the passion has faded, the meaning has drained out of whatever was supposed to matter. And so the person, not wanting to live in flatness, not knowing that what they're experiencing is actually peace, introduces turbulence. Sometimes consciously, sometimes not. They pick the fight that didn't need to happen. They create the drama that reignites the intensity. They make a decision that disrupts the stability, because disruption is the only emotional register that feels real. Epictetus spoke about this in terms of what we have trained ourselves to want. The desires we carry are not neutral. They are shaped by what we have experienced, reinforced by what we have survived, and calcified by what we have come to believe is normal. A person who grew up in a volatile environment didn't just experience volatility. They learned to associate it with love, with presence, with proof that something matters. Calm in that economy doesn't mean safe, it means forgotten. It means the other person has stopped caring. This is the hidden structure beneath the sabotage. It's not that the person wants to destroy the consistency. It's that they genuinely don't recognize it as something worth keeping. It doesn't feel like enough. It doesn't feel like real life. Care feels like waiting for the real thing to begin, and so they reach for the match, not to burn it down, but to feel something they recognize. Marcus Aurelius wrote about the discipline of wanting what you already have, not as resignation, not as the suppression of ambition, as a correction of perception, the recognition that the mind left untrained will always find the present insufficient and the absent desirable. The stable relationship will always seem less vivid than the imagined dramatic one. The working life will always seem less compelling than the fantasy of the life that hasn't started yet. The Stoic practice here is not to manufacture gratitude. It's to examine with real honesty whether what you're calling emptiness is actually emptiness, or whether it's peace that you haven't learned to inhabit yet. Whether what you're calling stagnation is actually stagnation, or whether it's the unremarkable texture of a life that is, quietly and without announcement, working. Because sustainability is not the enemy of meaning. It is the condition under which meaning becomes possible. The relationship that lasts is not the one that burns most intensely. It's the one that remains present through the ordinary days, The Tuesdays, the unremarkable weeks, the stretches of life that don't demand anything extraordinary from either person. Learning to stay in that, to resist the impulse to introduce chaos when peace arrives, is one of the quietest and most demanding forms of growth a person can undertake. It doesn't look like anything from the outside. It produces no drama worth describing. It simply results over time in a life that holds. But consistency requires something that goes even deeper than tolerance for the ordinary. It requires the willingness to remain visible, to stay present even when the most powerful instinct is to disappear. You disappear before you can be left. There is a moment, and if you've lived this pattern, you'll recognize it instantly, where everything is good, the connection is real, the thing you're in is working, and something inside you begins to go quiet. Not in a peaceful way, in the way of a person who is already planning the exit, not because they want to leave, but because leaving first is the only form of control they know how to exercise over loss. This is the disappearance pattern, and it is one of the most painful forms of self-sabotage, not only because of what it destroys externally, but because of what it confirms internally every single time it runs. It doesn't always look like physical leaving. Sometimes it looks like emotional withdrawal, becoming less available, less present, less responsive, while remaining technically in the relationship or the situation. The body stays, the investment leaves, and the other person, sensing the change, begins to react, with confusion, with distance of their own, with questions that don't get real answers, until eventually the gap becomes wide enough that the ending happens almost on its own, and the person who created it can tell themselves, with some accuracy, "I knew this would happen. I knew they would leave, except they didn't leave. You made it impossible for them to stay." Marcus Aurelius wrote about the stories we tell ourselves to justify the choices we have already made beneath conscious awareness. The mind is extraordinarily capable of constructing narratives that make self-protective behavior look like wisdom, make preemptive withdrawal look like discernment, make the decision to disappear look like the recognition of something real that others simply couldn't see yet. These stories are not lies exactly. They contain elements of truth, but they are assembled in service of a conclusion that was reached before the evidence was examined. The conclusion in this pattern is always the same. I will be left. It is only a matter of time, and so I will leave first, in whatever form leaving can take, so that the loss happens on my terms rather than theirs. What this pattern never accounts for is the cost. Not the cost to the relationship, though that cost is real. The cost to the person running it. Because every time you disappear before you can be left, you reinforce the belief that made you disappear in the first place. You never discover whether the thing would have lasted. You never find out if the person would have stayed. You exit before the evidence is in, and you carry forward into the next relationship, the next opportunity, the next moment of real connection, a conviction that was never actually tested. Epictetus, in the Discourses, returned repeatedly to the idea that the only things truly within our power are our own judgments, our own responses, our own internal movements. Everything else, how long something lasts, whether someone stays, what the future holds, lies outside the sphere of our control. The disappearance pattern is an attempt to control the uncontrollable, to manage loss by preempting it, to avoid the pain of being left by ensuring you are always the one who leaves first. But the pain arrives anyway. It simply arrives earlier, and with the added weight of having been self-inflicted. The interruption of this pattern doesn't begin with staying. It begins with noticing the moment the withdrawal starts, the specific instant when the internal temperature drops, when the presence begins to thin, when the planning begins beneath the surface of normal behavior. That moment of noticing is the only place where a different choice becomes available, not the choice to guarantee the outcome, not the choice to ensure you won't be hurt, the choice to remain present in something real without demanding certainty about how it ends. That is the hardest thing, and it is also, the Stoics would say, the only thing that is actually yours to do. The moment you start winning, you change the game. There is a pattern so well disguised as ambition that most people who live it never recognize it for what it is. It looks like drive. It looks like high standards. It looks like the refusal to settle, the commitment to excellence, the kind of relentless self-improvement that self-help culture celebrates without reservation. From the outside, it appears to be the engine of success. From the inside, it functions as something else entirely, a mechanism for ensuring that success, in any form it actually arrives, never fully counts. Here is how it works. You set a goal, you work toward it with genuine effort and real sacrifice. You get close, closer than you've ever been, close enough that the thing is almost within reach. And then at exactly that moment, something shifts. The goal moves, the standard elevates. The definition of success quietly rewrites itself so that what you are about to achieve is no longer quite enough. Not dramatically, not in a way that announces itself as sabotage. Simply, the target relocates and you find yourself once again not quite there. The person living this pattern will tell you they're simply raising their standards. They'll describe it as growth, as the natural evolution of someone who refuses to be complacent. And there is a version of that which is true. Genuine ambition does expand as capacity grows, but genuine ambition is accompanied by the ability to recognize arrival, to register the achievement as real, to allow the success to land, to inhabit the moment of having done the thing before immediately moving to the next thing that must be done. What this pattern produces instead is permanent motion without arrival. A life in which you are always working, always improving, always almost there, and never in any moment you can actually feel here. Epictetus wrote about the distinction between what depends on us and what does not. Our effort, our judgment, our commitment, these depend on us. The outcome, the recognition, the external confirmation that we have arrived, these do not. The person who moves the target the moment they approach it has inverted this entirely. They have made arrival, a thing that depends on external circumstances and their own perception of them, the only condition under which they will allow themselves to rest. And since arrival is always redefined before it can be reached, rest never comes. The permission to have succeeded is perpetually deferred. But this is not simply exhausting. It is a form of self-erasure, because what it ultimately communicates, not to the world but to the person themselves, is that there is no version of their success that is sufficient, no achievement that is real enough, no amount of effort that finally justifies the right to feel that they have made it. The internal verdict is always the same, regardless of the external evidence. Not yet, not quite, not enough. Marcus Aurelius understood the seduction of this. He wrote in the Meditations about the way the mind constructs future conditions for present peace. The belief that clarity, rest, and genuine contentment are things that will arrive after the next threshold is crossed, the next problem is solved, the next version of the self is achieved. He returned to the same correction again and again across years of private writing. The life is now, the work is now. The person you are waiting to become is either the person you are choosing to be in this moment, or a fiction that will always be one step ahead of you. There is something worth naming directly here, because it is uncomfortable and important. The pattern of moving the target is not always about fear of failure. Sometimes, and this is the version that requires the most honesty to see, it is about fear of arrival itself. Because arrival means the question gets answered. The thing you spent years working toward either becomes real or it doesn't. And as long as you are still moving, still improving, still almost there, the question remains open. You are still in the process. You have not yet been tested by the reality of having what you wanted. Moving the target keeps the test from happening. It keeps the question from being answered. It keeps you in permanent motion, which feels like ambition, which feels like drive, but which is at its core a refusal to find out what happens when you actually stop running. The Stoic response to this is not to lower your standards. It is to separate the practice from the outcome, To commit fully to the work without making the legitimacy of that work contingent on a result that is always being redefined. To find within the effort itself, within the quality of attention you bring to what you're doing today, the thing you keep looking for at the next threshold, because the next threshold will not give it to you. It never has, and if you are honest about the pattern, you already know that. The question is whether you are willing to stop long enough to let what you have built actually be what it is, complete, real, and yours. Which brings us to the hardest question of all. Not why you sabotage. You've seen the patterns, you recognize the mechanics. The harder question is what it actually takes to stop, not in theory, in the specific, ordinary moments of your actual life. What stopping the thread actually requires. We've covered a great deal of ground. And if you've recognized yourself in more than one of these patterns, in the fear of calm, in the testing, in the movement of the target, in the disappearance, in the belief that you must keep suffering to deserve what you have, the recognition itself might feel like a kind of weight. Another thing you're doing wrong. Another layer of internal complexity to manage. That's not what this is for. The Stoics were not interested in self-criticism as a practice. They were interested in self-examination as one. There is a significant difference. Self-criticism loops. It produces shame, and shame produces the same behaviors it condemns. The withdrawal, the self-protection, the conviction that you are fundamentally broken in a way that others are not. Self-examination done correctly moves. It produces clarity. And clarity, as Marcus Aurelius understood it, is not a feeling. It is a capacity. The capacity to see your own internal movements as they are happening, without the distortion of narrative, justification, or self-protection. The Stoics had a practice for this. They called it prosoche. Translated, it means attention, modern but not the passive kind. Active, deliberate, continuous attention to the movements of your own mind. Not occasional reflection, not the annual reckoning you make with yourself at the end of a difficult year, but a daily, moment-to-moment practice of watching what is actually happening inside you before it translates into behavior. Prosoche is what makes the difference between seeing the pattern after it has already run and catching it at the moment it begins. Between recognizing 3 months later that you withdrew from something good and noticing in real time the specific instant when the withdrawal begins, the moment the internal temperature drops, the moment the distance starts, the moment you begin constructing the case for why this thing you have built is not quite real enough to keep. That moment, that specific, almost invisible instant, is where all 10 of these patterns live. Not in the dramatic ending, in the quiet beginning. In the small movement that precedes the behavior, that precedes the outcome that you then look back on and cannot explain. Here is where to begin. Not with a resolution, not with a commitment to be different. With a single concrete practice. At the end of each day, ask yourself one question. Not, did I do well today? Not, am I making progress? Those questions invite performance. The question is this: what did I move away from today and why? Not what failed, not what went wrong. What did you pull back from? Create distance from, begin to disqualify, begin to leave, begin to move the target on. And what was the internal movement that preceded it? Was it the familiar misreading of karma's danger? Was it the test? Was it the audit of your own right to have what you have? You don't need to answer the question completely. You need to see it clearly enough that the next time the movement begins, you recognize it before it becomes behavior. That recognition, that half-second of genuine seeing, is the entire practice. Everything else follows from it. Epictetus said that the first and most fundamental task of philosophy is this: to examine what we have received as true without examination, and to refuse to act on it until we have looked at it clearly. Most of the patterns we've discussed today are built on beliefs that were received, not chosen. Beliefs about what you deserve, about what safety feels like, about what consistency means, about what it costs to be seen. They arrived before you were old enough to question them, and they have been running beneath the surface of your decisions ever since. You cannot choose what you are given. You can choose what you examine, and you can choose, in the specific moments that matter, to act from the examined version of yourself rather than the reflexive one. That is not a transformation. It doesn't happen once in a single moment of clarity and then stay. It is a practice, daily, imperfect, sometimes invisible in its results, but it accumulates, and over time the thread gets pulled less often, not because you've fixed something broken, but because you've learned to see the hand that reaches for it before the damage is done. Marcus Aurelius wrote near the end of the Meditations, something that has nothing of triumph in it and everything of truth. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength, not happiness, not success, not the guarantee that things will go well. Strength. The particular strength of a person who knows what is actually happening inside them, who has stopped mistaking their own patterns for reality, and who has learned, slowly, imperfectly, through repeated practice, to stay present in a life that is, against all the old expectations, actually working. That's the work. It's not glamorous, it doesn't make for a dramatic ending, but it holds. And if you made it here, if something in this video touched a pattern you've been living without fully seeing, then you already know that the recognition is real. That's not nothing, that's in fact where everything begins. If this video reached something that usually stays quiet, consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications. I read the comments. Every one of them. Because often the next topic comes from what you share. The experiences that are difficult to put into words, the conflicts that most people carry alone. You're not the only one living these patterns in silence. And sometimes simply knowing that is the thing that makes it possible to begin. Thank you for your time, your attention, and for choosing to spend it here. See you in the next one.